Hurricanes. Hurricanes originate as just regular old thunderstorms off the coast of Africa, right around the equator. That hot water and the movement across the Atlantic over warm water, it picks up steam. The hot air coming off that ocean rises, then it begins to rotate, and as it rotates and the warm air rises, it's kind of a positive feedback. It starts to rise faster and rotate faster and rise faster and rotate faster. As it rotates, then underneath the warm air is rising, there's going to be a low pressure system that forms underneath the hurricane. So hurricanes are categorized 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 based primarily on their wind speed. That wind speed then kind of dictates what the damage is going to be at landfall, and then also with that barometric pressure, what the storm surge is going to be. The storm surge is a giant wave that comes in with the storm that is an actual rise in the sea surface related to that low pressure system. As pressure is taken off the ocean, the surface rises. Hurricanes are part of a class of storms called tropical cyclones. We call them hurricanes here on the east coast of North America, but in other parts of the world, they're called cyclones or typhoons. So Central America, Mexico, those storms sometimes hit Hawaii. Those are hurricanes. Cyclones down here through Madagascar and Africa, cyclones around Australia and parts of Indonesia, and then typhoons in Asia. The hazards from hurricanes start with those high winds. The wind and the rain cause flooding. That intense precipitation can really cause a lot of flood damage and landslides. The wind also drives in big waves. Remember, the size of waves depends on the duration, the fetch, the speed of the wind, and hurricanes have all three of those to the max. So coming in with a hurricane, that low pressure system builds up lower and lower and lower, and then the sea surface rises, and then as it hits land, then it brings in what is called the storm surge. The storm surge is always going to cause more damage if it happens at high tide, and then for sure the damage is more if the topography of that coastal area is low. If the dunes, if there's no dunes, then there's going to be a larger impact. Barrier islands do protect mainland communities, as well as mangrove swamps do also protect the coastlines in the south, especially through Florida. There have been some very deadly hurricanes in U.S. history. The deadliest natural disaster actually ever in America was a hurricane in Galveston, Texas, right at the turn of the century in 1900. In that they have just estimates that 8,000, maybe more, died, and 31 U.S. dollars at this, taking what was lost then and turning into 2020 numbers, $31 billion. Basically, the whole island of Galveston, Texas was overtaken by the storm surge and washed away the island. Katrina in 2003 that hit New Orleans was an $80 billion storm. Almost 2,000 people died in that storm, which is an amazing number of people to have died in modern times in a big storm. That occurred because of the breaking of the levee that occurred in New Orleans. And plus, it was just a big storm. Hurricane Sandy, more recently in 2012, over 100 people died in that storm. It did not cause $30 to $50 worth of damage. That number should be in the billions. It actually, like the subway in New York City and lots of coastal communities in New Jersey. Sea level change. So sea level change, we think about it these days relating really closely to climate change. But really, sea level change, up or down, can occur throughout geologic history through tectonic changes, tectonic uplift, or subsidence. Then there's also glaciation. Glaciers in an area can push down on the land surface, making it seem like sea level is rising, but really the land is sinking. And then when the glaciers melt, we have what's called post-glacial rebound, where the land is rising, so it looks like sea level is falling. Some of that is happening in New England right now. Human activity. So we talked about in the groundwater chapter how Venice is sinking, New Orleans is sinking, Galveston is sinking. Some of that is from extraction of water as well as oil and gas. And during that extraction, there's compaction of the pore spaces in the aquifer, and the ground sinks. That's subsidence. The other human activity is indeed climate change. We call it climate change these days instead of global warming because it's so much more than just a temperature change. It's a whole climate change. What that leads to, sea level change, all those different causes, coastal erosion. So as sea level rises, storms and hurricanes, which are big storms, it just high tides, those all seem to have more impact because the sea level's higher. Drowned valleys, streams that come down into the sea have river channels, and as sea level rises into those river channels, then we have what's called drowned valleys. So salt water goes further up into river channels, and then there's just a loss of land associated with sea level rise. There it is. This is bedrock, and this is thinking about sea level rise. It's more than just climate change right now. There's also the history of sea level changes throughout Earth's history. So at one point, probably during the last glaciation 20,000 years ago or so, the sea was, before that, the sea was higher and cut out this wave, this notch here, and then as sea level is dropping here, then it exposes that wave cut notch, and maybe up here was another wave cut notch. So sea level was at this point, then it was here, and now it's here. So over time, the drop in sea level is apparent. So maybe this is one of the stages in the dropping of sea level after the last glaciation. Sea level rise causes the coastlines to move inland, drowning river valleys. So on the left is a fjord. That's a U-shaped valley that was carved by glaciation. Glaciers, when they fill up valleys like this, don't just carve a point in the valley floor. They carve the entire valley. That's why they're U-shaped. On the right here is a typical estuary that may run into a river channel, and that the water level in those estuaries also gets higher and higher and higher. If the rate is slow enough, the estuarine deposits can keep up with sea level rise. The way sea level rise is happening so quickly right now, it's hard for those estuary environments to keep up. So there's lots of coastal erosion that occurs in those estuaries, especially in South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. Lots of coastal erosion focused on the estuaries. When sea level drops, and the opposite is true, it's going to expose the continental shelf. The river's going to cut through those sediments to a new baseline, the new sea level. All right, sea level rise and fall. Globally, sea level has been rising about 2 millimeters a year for the past few decades because of changes with the Industrial Revolution and the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're not really slowing down our emissions of carbon dioxide, so the temperatures are still rising. In fact, even if we stopped burning fossil fuels today, temperatures would still be rising to catch up with the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere. If sea level rises 1 meter, most of all of Bangladesh, which is beside India, would be drowned. There's land all around the world that is below sea level. If you ever go to New Orleans, you can look up and see boats because of the levees along the Mississippi. As sea level continues to rise, New Orleans is going to get flooded more and more often. Large parts of the Netherlands and islands in the South Pacific are also right at sea level and experiencing high levels of inundation right now. Watch this video if you have a chance. The largest Cavian Glacier just really talks about the changes in glaciation associated with climate change. Oh yeah, here's Bangladesh. This is Bangladesh. And the river systems that dissect Bangladesh, they flood heavily with those typhoons that come through seasonally in Bangladesh, and the whole country is really at risk for having environmental refugees related to climate change. How do we measure sea level? It's tricky because of plate tectonics and that glacial rebound and subsidence and from glaciers. So the best way to do it is to use a satellite system, and the satellites can look at the rising and falling of the oceans and get a real accurate measurement of sea level rise. That satellite is called Poseidon, that measures sea level rise or sea level. These images just show what it would look like if sea level rose. So if the West Antarctic, remember Antarctica has the West and the East Antarctic ice sheets. If the West Antarctic ice sheet melted, it would raise global sea levels by as much as 20 feet. So in that, we would lose, in here, 13 islands lost in the last 400 years already off the coast of like the Potomac River. So we would lose a lot of the island areas around Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia. If the East Antarctic ice sheet were to melt, that's the other lobe over there. No one really believes it just is going to happen anytime soon, but if it did, it would raise sea levels around the world as much as 200 feet. So at that point, Washington, D.C. would be underwater, Philadelphia would be underwater, Baltimore would be underwater. Most of Long Island would be underwater, New York City underwater. Another problem, environmental issue with the coastlines is pollution. Half of all people worldwide live within 60 miles of the ocean, and that increases that number every day. People love flocking to our coastlines. There's a lot of trash at our coastlines, not only solid trash, but also sewage. Pre-1991, it was legal to dump garbage off the Atlantic coast with the right permits, and most of that garbage was sewage sludge. If you've ever toured a wastewater treatment facility, you know there's a lot of solid, weird, foamy sludge that comes out of that system, and it can't really be used to fertilize plants because they're worried about disease. So it was dumped into our ocean basins. These days, it's treated more like a talk hazardous material and disposed of the right way. But runoff, oil spills, toxic chemicals, fertilizers, solid garbage, sewage, airborne emissions, dredge sediments. These are all things that continue to get into our ocean basins. If you want to watch this video about the garbage patch with Oprah, Oprah does a little segment on the garbage patches that are formed by those gyres out in the middle of our ocean basins, and plastic garbage gets swirled into a mass out in those ocean basins. In the olden days, and still today, it's really easy to dispose of waste if you just put your outhouse right over water, because the water just washes it away. What happens though is when it gets concentrated, when your outhouse and my outhouse are in the same area, then we've got two. Then more people move in, and we all live on the island and we're all swimming out here in a toxic mix of sewage. So in some places this is okay, but for the most part we would frown upon putting sewage right out over our oceans. Why? Because really sewage sludge and poop acts as a fertilizer for the water. Your poop has nitrates, phosphates, bacteria, viruses. They act to feed the plants. So plants are going to grow in our oceans. That plant is phytoplankton, and these are little tiny algae that are floating around the sea. The phytoplant means they photosynthesize. the plants are going to die and decay. During that decay process, the bacteria that decays those plants are going to use up all the oxygen, depleting the dissolved oxygen levels and making it so that the fish have a hard time breathing. Fertilizing those plants is called eutrophication. That word just means well fed. The plants are go through eutrophication. You have algal blooms, and the fish can't breathe and they die. This happens in parts of our ocean in the Chesapeake Bay and in the Gulf of Mexico, and we call it like the dead zone. And it happens at the mouth of big rivers like the Mississippi. It gets really worse in estuaries where water isn't circulated very well, where the open ocean and inlets don't bring in very much water to flush out that system, nor does it release very much water out those shallow inlets. So it gets trapped in those estuaries and really causes a problem on the east coast of the United States, especially with the Albemarle and the Pamlico Sound. We have that problem going on with hog farms.